All right, everybody, gather round. It is time for another journey into the nostalgia trap. My name is David Parsons. I hope you enjoy what we've got for you today. Today we're talking about the carceral state. When I say the carceral state, I mean the web of police and surveillance and mass incarceration that have become so normal and so taken for granted in American life, but it wasn't always this way. None of this happened accidentally. None of this happened overnight. This is part of a decades-long campaign, and as I think back, I realized that when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, I was subjected to this campaign, a campaign of fear around all sorts of things: gangs, drugs, kidnappers, all sorts of horrific reasons why we needed the police to protect us and why the police and courts and prisons needed more power, more money, more ability to wreck people's lives. And look where it's brought us. Look where it's fucking brought us, right? So that campaign is something we got to understand. How did this happen? What brought us to this point? My guest today is someone who can shed light on that. And not only that, he helps me understand a little bit of my childhood. His book is called Stranger Danger: Family Values, Childhood, and the American Carceral State. And his name is Paul Renfro. He's an assistant professor of history at Florida State University. And he tells me all about his book and all about this thing called Stranger Danger that emerges in the late 70s and 80s. This fear, this kind of hysteria, this panic around the idea that children, specifically little angelic white children, were going to be kidnapped, raped, and murdered. Something that was drilled into my mind and soul as a child through TV, movies. We talk about America's Most Wanted and John Walsh, whose son Adam was murdered in a really horrific case that kind of got this whole ball rolling. But either way, it's a really complicated issue. And it's a really important one to understand how things like this, particularly irrational fears, as embedded in a kind of larger, racialized mindset, can be weaponized by power and can be exploited and leave us at the place we're at now, right? Where policing and surveillance and incarceration have become, organizing principles of our government and our culture. It's terrifying. So the story that Paul Renfro tells in this book is a really important one. I hope you enjoy this conversation. You can find lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff all over the place. Go to nostalgiatrap.com. That's kind of our clearinghouse with all our free episodes. But we also do bonus stuff, conversations about pop culture and where we think the COVID nightmare is going, etc. Those are just for subscribers. And if you want in on those conversations, you got to subscribe at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And that's something that helps us out and keeps the whole program going. So thanks so much to the people who are already supporting the show, and I'm really enjoying the conversations we're having there. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is me with Paul Renfro. All right. So, Paul Renfro, thanks so much for joining us. You have a book out. I want to get the title out just to start us off. Your book is called Stranger Danger: Family Values, Childhood, and the American Carceral State. And when I was reading through it this weekend, I was thinking to myself, this is the type of book that historians love to find when they're working on research, because it seems like you found a subject that somehow is this subject, and I'll just say it real quick and we can get into it. But the subject of the book is the kind of concern about kids being kidnapped in the 70s and 80s. And you convince me through the course of this book that subject actually contains so many really vital trends in American history, and it allows you to talk about a lot of stuff. And I guess my first question, just to start us off, is, first of all, thanks for being here, but also, was there a moment that you kind of, an aha moment where you kind of discovered, oh, this subject actually is a subject that contains all these different strands? Because it seems like it ties a lot of things together for me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, David.
For sure.
So yeah, I think so. When I started out researching this project, I thought it was relatively narrow, especially because there was a kind of paucity of literature kind of about this specifically. There had been a book by Paula Fass, who's this really eminent historian of childhood and youth. But she didn't, I think, really kind of tie it to broader conversations about the carceral state or broader processes of suburbanization, white flight, and the kind of potency of white childhood innocence and the ways in which it's kind of used and abused in so many different ways. So yeah, I think my aha moment was probably just kind of looking, and this is, not particularly insightful, but the kind of linkages between Clinton and Reagan or Clinton and Bush. There's this through line where each of them are kind of using white childhood in particular ways. And they're not even being really, they're not concealing this at all. It's quite blatant. So, what started off with just kind of as something that's looking as a book or a project that was looking at kids being snatched and the kind of moral panic, sex panic that sort of resulted, it became, as you noted, something that I think is speaking to broader concerns and this sort of larger anxiety that I think can be connected to a lot of different phenomena in American politics and recent American political history. And it's this fear of the child being exploited, the child being, somehow, exploited or the notion of childhood being undermined. And of course, that's highly racialized, it's highly sexualized, and it has kind of gender and class dimensions. And so, through the case studies and through these various developments on the federal level that I talk about, I think I hopefully am kind of exposing a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, you connect. I mean, and we can get into this, but I mean, you connected even to like going back into like Indian captivity narratives and larger kind of ideological and cultural trends in American history, going all the way back, which is something we do on this show. We like to kind of connect, especially like suburbanization to like colonial settlers, settler colonialism, and like the kind of idea that there's a through line when you're speaking about the family, and particularly like the white family as this kind of core unit, as a way of talking about politics and a way about talking about culture. But also, I mean, your book really brought up like, I don't know, my own childhood. I kind of like, the first thing you talk about in your introduction is the Adam Walsh murder, which was something that really haunted my childhood. And reading the details of it, I remembered everything about it. I remembered all the little details about a mom taking her little boy to the mall and letting him play video games for a little bit by himself, and all of a sudden disappearing. All of those details were things that I heard about. And I think I'm pretty sure I heard about them from like my own parents, who told me, not to walk away from them in the mall. And it really was, you capture something that's like, something that I experienced from the child end of it, if that makes sense. I wonder if it's something you remember as well, growing up with this fear, because it really convinced me that basically at some point I was going to be kidnapped and murdered. Like that seemed like that was the main thrust, was like the main danger in life as a American child is that some stranger is going to entice you into a van and take you away and kill you. And like that part of it seems like you've done a lot of work to tell us that this didn't pop up just accidentally. It's something that's like a really profound trend that goes into every area, even like the government, etc. I'm wondering if do you remember the Adam Walsh murder? Was that something that was your experience as well?
So I definitely grew up in what I call the kind of child safety regime, or kind of under that regime, so definitely this is the world that I grew up in, that I've inhabited my whole life. And to your point, it took me a long time to kind of disabuse myself of the idea that, I'm going to be killed by some nefarious stranger, or that kind of more broadly, the world is really dangerous and the world is really kind of mad and out to get you, right? As soon, I think it took me really until my college years to kind of realize that no, a lot of these things are just kind of, they're trumped up. There's a lot of panic and anxiety kind of, that kind of shapes American politics. And not just in the formal sense, but in this informal sense, which you're talking about and which I think the book talks about, which is just the sorts of lines that parents tell their children and the assumptions that are embedded in those ideas. Oh, be careful. My parents even now still say, if I go to a city like Atlanta, they'll say, well, be careful, right? And they don't say that if I go elsewhere, So there's a kind of racial dimension to this, clearly a class dimension of this, but I was born in 1987. The Walsh case happened in 81.
Yep.
And I think by the time I was born, that sort of logic or illogic was firmly entrenched. And it coincided, as you've indicated, with these larger concerns about, the war on drugs, the war on crime, getting tough. So I think no one has really kind of spoken about the interconnectedness of those different sorts of phenomena. And there is this sense that childhood, and I talk about this in the introduction, that childhood is apolitical. And it's just not. I mean, it is not. I mean, it's very clearly charged with all these different concerns.
Yeah.
And, when you're talking about a child being vulnerable or innocent, by extension, and this is, I think, demonstrated in various instances throughout the book, by extension, you're kind of talking about other people who are not as innocent or who are not as vulnerable. And that is clearly the case with what happens in Atlanta with the youth abductions and murders there. These children are not understood to be as innocent, as worthy as, say, Eitan Pates in Manhattan or the Iowa Paperboys, right? So childhood and kind of who gets a childhood is coded white and it's coded middle class. To your point, there's this idea that this is the threat, right? In mainstream media, in kind of certain political circles, that this is the threat that is facing children. And of course, they're really only talking about middle class white children, or mostly, right?
And not only that, but even like a certain look. Like that was one of the most kind of compelling and stunning points from your book that I drew, was this kind of that there was a homogeneity to the kind of young boy that might be featured on the back of a milk carton, which is something that I don't think young people today know as much about. Like, I don't know if the milk carton thing is as big a phenomenon as it was when I was younger. But yeah, the idea that that certain boys and certain children have a look of innocence about them that's sexualized and has there's almost a narrative embedded within the types of photos that are circulated. And that part of it was super disturbing.
Yeah, people, I think, struggle to talk about that sort of thing because there is, a way in which people kind of fetishize childhood innocence. And it doesn't have to be automatically kind of sexual, but there is a sort of desire. There is kind of a longing, right?
Yeah.
So when you have images circulating of Eitan Pates or Adam Walsh, they typify something and they speak to something that people desire or they want, right? So in the circulation of those images, the book kind of argues, it's reifying that threat and it's reinforcing the very idea that childhood innocence looks a certain way. And it is, for a variety of reasons, at least according to these crusaders, it is under a particular threat right now, or, in the 80s or 90s. The world is getting more dangerous, more violent. And of course, none of that was actually true. But even though I think generally, at least I hope, most people think or know now that stranger abduction is not really a serious threat. I mean, it happens, but it's extremely rare. But I think there is still
the statistic you cite that I remember is something like what, a couple hundred stranger abductions a year compared to hundreds of thousands of more familial or domestic kidnappings. It seemed in other words, the focus was in the wrong area.
Totally, yeah. So the initial kinds of boosters for this sort of cause were kicking around these figures. 50,000 children are abducted by strangers in any given year. Some said it was even higher. And it's really difficult to kind of quantify this, but it seems like there are maybe 100 to 300 or 400 of these cases each year, and that's in a country of 320 million people. This is not something that really happens all that frequently. It's almost invariably missing children, which kind of connotes this particularly vulnerable child, a child that looks a certain way. That became sort of the umbrella under which a lot of these different advocates are operating. But the missing child, kind of your prototypical missing child, is a runaway, and it's a teenager. It's not a 6-year-old boy, or it's someone who is abducted in a custody battle, or who is abducted by some sort of acquaintance.
Right.
So these stranger danger cases, they're so kind of embedded in a certain American imagination is kind of problematic to say, but I think there is a certain generation, right, who very much imbibe these cases and the lore of all these different sorts of cases that were all strung together and were supposed to speak to a larger problem, but they really didn't, right? These are actually very exceptional cases. And yet they became fodder for, I think, a really kind of dangerous sort of undercurrent in American politics, or maybe not even an undercurrent.
I agree. And I think you see it all the way into today and in different ways that it's evolved. But at the same time, I feel there's a certain kind of era that you're locating here. And I'm wondering, if we're putting on our historian caps, why is this happening? Why is there an anxiety among family, a certain type of American family in America starting in the 1970s and into the 80s? Why do you think this happened? Because I feel like there are a lot of different explanations, but what are some of them?
Yeah, there are tons. There's obviously this economic component to it, this sense of status anxiety. The Fordist social contract is being shredded. People are not able to provide in the same way that they did. There's a sense that, to your point, that the family, as it was kind of constituted in the popular imagination, there goes that problematic phrase again, at least in and people still gesture to this. Even people on the left kind of gesture to this sometimes, saying that there was a kind of New Deal family that is something that maybe we could strive for or strive to kind of rekindle in some way, this family form. And of course, there are larger movements that are challenging this family form from other directions as well. Obviously, the feminist movement, gay rights movement, the civil rights movement. African Americans are seeking inclusion within, or at least some African American activists are seeking inclusion within this contract. Basically this idea that the state will kind of support certain family forms, will encourage the production of children, procreation, and the like, and through generous subsidies, home loans, what have you. So as that's being shredded, as that is becoming less and less viable, I think there's a larger sense that the family is under threat, not only because it is kind of perhaps entering this sort of economic precariat, but also because crime is on the rise. There's a fear among especially kind of white suburbanites that that African Americans are unruly, that there are incidents of unrest and disorder in the cities, and hopefully that won't kind of bleed into the suburbs. So there's that fear of crime that very much drives this idea that our family needs to fortify the family home. And the child obviously is kind of the center of a lot of this. And I think I, in passing, mentioned the gay rights movement, but I think there's a very potent threat, as a lot of people understand it, that gay men are liberated, they're sexually liberated, but they're also kind of very deviant, and they are going to kind of repurpose the Anita Bryant phrase, kind of to recruit your children. So that's, at least I argue, one reason why, at least initially in the late 70s and into the early 80s, the cases that were really motoring this were cases of young boys, and mostly young white boys, with the Atlanta cases being the exception. But of course, that is somewhat of an outlier in my study. But those are some of the reasons. There are many, many more.
Yeah, and I mean, you even I think in your introduction mentioned the Vietnam War and Watergate and the breakdown of like trust in the government, and I mean it feels like there's a lot of different strands to this. But I wondered, it seems like a lot of historians kind of locate Ronald Reagan and Reaganism as a figure and a political movement that is in many ways a culmination of a lot of the trends in conservatism that were coming out of the 70s, and it feels connected to that. How much of this? Because I know, like you kind of, for me, you convinced me that this isn't like necessarily a conservative thing, but it seems like there's at least in terms of the early outbreak of hysteria and wanting to do something about it, that you might locate this as a conservative impulse or beginnings of like a conservative power thing that's happening. Because isn't he the first major figure to like kind of capitalize on these fears?
Totally, yeah. And when I began the study, and this began as a dissertation, that's kind of how I imagined this would turn out. And of course, everybody and their mother was writing a dissertation about the rise of the right at that time. And I think that was the kind of prevailing framework, the kind of dominant paradigm. And I think people still kind of work within that. And I think there's a political dimension to that, meaning kind of a personal political dimension, meaning a lot of people kind of want to, I think, pin a lot of the ills of recent American history on Republicans and on kind of a conservative mindset, right? And that serves to sort of absolve themselves, or at the very least say, well, Clinton was only kind of pushed to the right because of the Republicans, and there's nothing kind of inherent in liberalism. There's no sort of contradiction within liberalism that would spur somebody to, build up the carceral state, even though this is a project that people like Naomi Murakawa and others kind of tie to liberalism as a kind of post-war entity or as a post-war ideology with Truman and LBJ and others. So I think there's a kind of self-serving dimension to that. But so I was very clearly kind of I was operating in that mold, and then I realized that this is totally a bipartisan project, just as the carceral state more broadly is a bipartisan project. And sorry, what was your question again?
I'm just thinking about the way that exactly that, the way that this has been pitched, I think, as a conservative impulse, but is something that and maybe conservatives capitalized on early on, but it's something that is a much more broad-based impulse, and something that by the time you get to it's one of the more difficult things to grapple with your book, which is that they succeeded, whoever these forces are, succeeded in creating something, and I know it's a problematic term, but like in the popular imagination, that is this scary sex offender that is a figure that became tied to the carceral state in a way that becomes even almost taken for granted, that like a person like Bill Clinton can then do things like Amber Alerts and 3 strikes laws and all these things that are just it's a way of creating a remarkable consensus, because you've created a monster, the sex offender, that everyone, whether they're conservative or liberal or whatever, everyone agrees that person is like subhuman or doesn't have rights.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That part of it, I mean, it's difficult to talk about, because it's like almost like, I even speaking for the humanity of a sex offender is gonna, open you up to like severe critiques from every side. And that part of it seems like really scary to me, because you convinced me that the sex offender, quote unquote, is both a amorphous category and one who the elements of definition have expanded and changed over the years. And so it's almost like we've created a monster that is then a useful thing for us to use in kind of administering the democracy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And it's a really scary prospect, as you indicated, because if you have these carve-outs for sex offenders, if they are kind of an exceptional class, if they are understood to be subhuman, or Erica Miners and Judith Levine kind of argue that even attempts to humanize them, right, they are kind of laden with this idea that maybe they're not human, maybe they are just subhuman. They are these kind of creatures, these monsters that need to be dealt with. And it opens up all these different possibilities for the carceral state. And a lot of people on the left are liberals who want to reform, quote unquote, prisons or, kind of reconfigure the carceral state. They have a really tough time grappling with the figure of the sex offender, which, to your point, is largely kind of a construction, right? That's not to say that people don't harm people, right? There are sexual, people who perpetrate sexual harm. But a lot of times those people aren't in prison or they're not on the sex offender registry. And there's no evidence to suggest that the sex offender registry actually mitigates harm. It actually, protects people in any meaningful way. If anything, and I make this argument in, I think, the conclusion and in the Clinton chapter as well, it has this sort of logic that is kind of inherently premised on the family and the maintenance and reinforcement of the family as it's imagined in a lot of American political discourse, when the threat is kind of within that family, right? The notion of a sex offender registry or community notification is, there's a home and there's a family, there's a child within that home, and that child needs to be protected from exogenous threats, and this map or these listings will enable parents or guardians or acquaintances to steer the child clear of those houses because that's where the dangerous people live, and that's those are the people who are going to perpetrate harm. And that's just not the nature of child sexual abuse. I mean, it's almost not exclusively, but largely an overwhelming majority of these cases or these acts are perpetrated by people within the family or people that the child knows, right? So, there's, I think, I talk about Reagan as this real sort of, he very much traffics in that language of the family values, but it's pervasive. It is universal, and it's with the figure of the sex offender as it's constructed kind of in this historical period, it becomes unassailable. This sort of politics becomes unassailable. So, when you're trying to dismantle the carceral state or at least reform it, a lot of people don't want to deal with the sex offender. They want to say, well, those folks actually do deserve to be on a list, or they do deserve to be kind of subject to all these really harsh measures, or they deserve to be locked up indefinitely. And a lot of that kind of, I think, is attributable to the fact that this is sort of a medicalized sort of designation, or at least that's how people understand it, and it's really not the case.
It sounds very close to the way the way that people think about rape in America, which is, the stranger, right? When the vast majority of rapes and sexual assaults involving adults are of people that know each other, and that, and that part of it seems like when you're thinking about Megan's Law, right? Which here in California, you're able to look up. I don't know if Megan's Law is national or is it just California? I'm not sure.
It's national. It's national. It started in New Jersey as a state thing, and it's national. So it was signed in '96. The Clinton administration was very much on board with it as on the state level, and then it helped to enshrine it in federal law.
Right. So it's like the idea of going on a Zillow or Craigslist looking for houses, a family looking for a house, and then looking up Megan's Law, making sure there's no, child molester that lives in the neighborhood. It seems like just the wrong way of thinking about it, especially when you're thinking about, it's kind of incredible to me that in your book that as you describe Reagan, kind of creating this idea, or at least accelerating this idea about family values, because what you've identified is that this problem that of the monster that Reagan wants to also talk about is within the family, and it's a much more complicated. In other words, he's kind of separating these two things when it's something that's a little more or a lot more complicated.
Yeah, and a lot of the social movements of the mid-century were focused on kind of dismantling that family unit, and they recognized, the feminist movement recognized that this is a site of domination. This is a site where kind of gender inequality is sort of practiced or enacted and reinforced. And so they were very much seeking alternatives, and that's one reason why this kind of social contract ripped apart, because, the family, at least for a lot of people, was no longer the sort of sustainable unit, the viable unit through which a lot of these social policies could be administered.
Right. So there's almost this
there's this twisted logic to it, right?
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say that it sounds like, at the same time, there's this tremendous anxiety coming from maybe conservatives, but maybe others too, about the family breaking apart in the post-60s era for a number of reasons, and that the child molester or the person, the kidnapper, that monster becomes one way to explain why that's happening instead of a kind of more inward interrogation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Or, obviously there are these larger kind of global forces that are causing this. With globalization, obviously, and deindustrialization, outsourcing, and the like. But it is kind of funny in a very dark way how it's these sorts of figures, the sex offender, or the molester, or the welfare queen, even, if you kind of want to take a broader view
or
of
the
this.
gay man, or the radical feminist, or the Marxist professor. There's a lot of them, but it seems like a real searching for an explanation that can be embodied in a villain. Yeah,
and I don't think that is unique to this historical period. No. But it's something that is, I think, very clear here.
Yeah. I have people in my family who are still to this day very, very scared that their kids are going to be kidnapped and molested, and that's like still a fear. In other words, like, I overcame this maybe by reading stuff like your stuff and other analyses over the years, and you kind of connect this, but. At the other hand, what I wanted to say is that, like, these fears are still, like, operative, and that's part of, like, reading your book is a real mind fuck, because I'm sitting here reading about the 80s and the stuff that, like, kind of formed my ideas in childhood, and even I would say it was more the 90s, honestly, for me, because I was born in 1978, and by the time I get to the 90s, the case for me in high school was Polly Klaas, was a girl, I think a 12-year-old girl who was kidnapped and murdered, and it became the basis for the Three Strikes case, and Winona Ryder,
California,
Petaluma, California. Winona Ryder was on TV all the time. It seemed like a hometown case for us, and it was terrifying. But at the same time, I remember being in high school and being a little bit politically aware and understanding that the Three Strikes law was something that was going to be used in a much broader way than what it became. But I'm wondering if we can talk about, because I think it connects to what you're saying here about the family, is like these figures of the dads, because like John Walsh is the one that you profile so well in this book, but Mark Klaas is another one who there's something going on with the dads that emerge as the kind of voices of victimhood in this. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because especially with Walsh, it seems like he's always been a figure that's been all over the place for me.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I have never not known a time where John Walsh was kind of a national figure.
Yeah.
So I think he was tapped to host America's Most Wanted in 1988. And I, for the longest time, thought that he was an ex-cop. He kind of exuded that sort of machismo. He had the leather jacket, and, he would always kind of narrate these stories in a way that kind of suggested that he was, kind of bringing people to justice in a particular way. And he was this kind of guarantor of justice for the voiceless. And
well, not to interrupt, but it was on the show, because I watched the show growing up. Saturday night was on. Yeah, and it was on after Cops. It was like, so Cops was on Fox Friday nights, and then it was Saturday night. But Cops was on at 8, and at 8:30 was America's Most Wanted. And you're right, there was like if you remember the Detective John Bonnell, who was the guy on Cops, he was kind of a Walsh-like figure too. In other words, there was something going on with these kind of so I just want to be clear. John Walsh was not a cop at all. He's not connected to law enforcement at all, because you certainly get that idea from the show.
No, not at all. No,
wow.
I think he was an architect. Yeah, he was an architect.
Yeah,
and
jeez.
Yeah, he became this kind of voice for the victims' rights movement. He became this kind of embodiment of vigilante justice. And he is kind of the go-to talking head, I think, for a lot of these matters. And he's, I think, been on television really since then. Well, since his son's case, really. I mean, he was on Good Morning America kind of when he got the news that his son had been murdered, because they were out there, kind of spreading the news, raising awareness about the case and about missing children more broadly. And of course, I mean, this is not to diminish that, that heartache, and it's terrible. I mean, obviously a terrible thing. But there is something also to be said for the lives that have been ruined kind of in the name of avenging that child, or avenging other sorts of children who purportedly embody innocence in a kind of way. And the bad guys need to be taken off the street.
Yeah,
so that was Walsh for me. And yeah, I think they and I gestured to this in the introduction, they embody this sort of paternal protector mindset, or kind of performance, right? They're very good at that. So I think Walsh is very good at that. Class is excellent at policy. Actually, he simultaneously got 3 strikes implemented in California and on the federal level. So he was in conversation with the Clinton administration, and the Clinton administration sought that out. They wanted this guy to be on board with the crime bill in '94 and to be on board with the Clinton campaign in '96. And he wasn't, a huge figure by any means, but, looking at the archival documents, I mean, he's clearly kind of coordinating with them on policy, on optics. So he very much leaned into that. But there's something also to be said for mothers and the way that they kind of perform their roles, and they perform as these kind of bereaved parents, and help to propagate this as well, or to move the movement along. So you had obviously Julie Pates. It had Noreen Gosh, who was an interesting figure to be sure, and Patty Wetterling also, who is also really interesting because she's instrumental after her son was abducted and killed in 1989 in Minnesota. She's instrumental in helping to get the sex offender registry bill essentially passed. So the Jacob Wetterling Act, which mandated the adoption of sex offender registries nationwide. So there's a federal bill. It's tucked or kind of a part of the crime bill in '94. She subsequently changed her mind about it. She thought, okay, this is actually doing a lot of harm. So she, in many ways, has kind of sought to undo a lot of what she has been, what she had done, meaning getting the registry, more widespread than it was. So
that's interesting. So there are there are people that because it does feel like there has been in the years. Didn't even Bill Clinton and others have said like, well, we went too far during that era, and there's almost like a peel back happening. So so you're saying that even within the kind of community of people who were activists around this issue, have some of them have reversed themselves?
Yeah, I think Wetterling is one of those. Most people don't. It's, I think, to point back to or gesture back to our conversation, a lot of them don't even really think about this. They don't grapple with the fact that, there are something like 900,000 people on sex offender registries in the United States. So that's a huge segment of the carceral state, but it doesn't really get talked about. There's been this sort of reckoning, I think, some of it more legitimate, I think, than others. Folks kind of trying to make amends for the crime bill and the like. Even though Joe Biden doesn't seem interested in doing that, he doesn't have any regrets, apparently. But Clinton and
he was a figure who was one of those. You see clips of it now, but like he's during the crime bill and even before that, he's one of the people that really engaged in a lot of this, kind of discourse about monsters hurting your kids, and even racialized it in really ugly ways. It seems like he was a kind of a key figure in all this in some ways.
Totally. Yeah. No, absolutely. So I don't know if you've read David Stein's piece in The Intercept about how Reagan and Strom Thurmond were, to Reagan's right on a lot of these issues in the 80s, and helped to pull Reagan to the right when it came to specifically anti-drug legislation. So he's a key architect of a lot of this. Not to mention, to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier, his real sort of opposition to busing and his very ardent kind of defense of the white family. I think that these are things that he doesn't really acknowledge or really reckon with. But to your point, I mean, people have been, I think, recognizing, okay, this has gotten out of hand. But it seems like the sex offender registry is not something that people are willing to reconsider. It has to be this way, or at least that's how people imagine it, right? So even here in Florida, there is a bill that was passed in 2018. It was a referendum to allow ex-felons to vote, but excluded from that were murderers and sex offenders, anybody convicted of a felony sex offense.
Yeah.
So their rights, are completely stripped. There's no real recourse. And the worst part of this, even though this is a relatively small segment of the carceral state, but these civil commitment protocols, which the U.S. Supreme Court has said are wholly constitutional, these allow for the indefinite detention of people who are deemed sexually dangerous. So there's no real sort of, I think, reckoning with just how wide this has grown, how much it's metastasized. And I think a lot of that has to do with what we've been talking about, just how deeply embedded that idea is. There are monsters, there are bad people. These are the bad people. The state has identified them, and they will be locked up.
Yeah.
And it poses the question, or forces us to kind of ask, who is being served by this? Is harm actually being mitigated? Are people less likely now to be, sexually assaulted or incur harm? And I don't think that that's actually the case, or I think there is evidence to suggest that fewer people are being subject to that sort of thing, but it's not because of the sex offender registry. That in itself creates harm. It produces more harm, and it's incredibly wasteful. So there's no real reason for it. But I wish that people would actually talk about it. It does seem to be off the table entirely.
Yeah.
Even among activists, right? Even among people who want to dismantle the carceral state.
Dude, it just seems like, and that's part of what makes like the prison abolition thing so tricky as an ideology, but also so compelling to me, because it's like they're actually, the reaction to it is so powerful. It's like, well, you must be tapping into something very strong, something that's very strongly felt. If I go out on the street and say we need to stop the sex offender registries, people are going to basically think I'm a sex offender. That's basically what it comes down to. So it's like, and even if they don't, they'll think that there are so many other people that are worthy of your help. Why are you concentrating on these low people? And it just seems like, because there's so much emotion invested in it, it's probably a pretty like a hot topic, and by that I mean something that's tapping into some really deep shit. But also, it's like, the sex offender registries are new. Like, this isn't something that was around. And the fact that we've created a part of the carceral state that you're saying like includes like 900,000 people is just kind of stunning to me. And a book like yours, which kind of has a sober accounting of it and tells us that like this. Not only has this not helped us, this has just created more harm. That seems like pretty obvious, and yet at the same time, it seems as far from something we would reverse in our society as anything else. It seems really, it seems really tricky to address something like that.
Yeah, because you don't want to diminish the harm that people have faced and that they continue to face, right? And there's this real sort of thirst for vengeance in our society, and part of it, and I think you were talking about with Yasmin Nair about this feeling of just kind of, you relish the fact that, at least initially, when someone like Harvey Weinstein gets sentenced to prison, right? And there's this idea, that's justice. But, just interrogating it for 2 seconds, that's not justice. That is, it's terrible. It's a terrible thing. Nobody is served by that.
Yeah.
Nobody benefits from that. He's very clearly a sick person, or at least a miserable person who has done a lot of harm, but is locking him up for the rest of his life. And, some people kind of joking about him incurring the same fate. Is that really what justice looks like? Yeah. That does not seem to wash for me.
And doesn't address the real kind of problems that produce this kind of behavior, right? And produced it, right. The abuse was it was something that Harvey Weinstein as an individual committed, but at the same time, I really see it as emerging out of the power structures and the patriarchy and the capitalism and all the stuff that kind of surrounded him and put him in the position to be able to do this for years and years and not be subjected to, the kind of recrimination that other people would be subjected to. In other words, his position as a rich Hollywood mogul allowed him to get away with this. That's really the side of what we should be talking about, in the same way that talking about family values and the structure of the family itself as talk about a conversation that the Reagan people don't want to have, which is that how is this Reagan family producing this shit? Because that's really the site of the monstrosity. We've got strangers running around and that's a problem, but the vast majority of these kinds of crimes are being committed within the family, coming out of the patriarchal structure. And that just seems like when I think about it that way, it seems like we really are, talking past each other. We're very much in very different kind of places. But it almost seems like a hallmark of the American family, at least a white suburban family as produced on television. It is a security element, is a fear, is a protection of the children. And that became more and more over the years, to the point where now, if you go in an electronics store, a huge part. I hadn't been in Best Buy for a long time. I know none of us can be in Best Buy now, but I went in Best Buy 6 months ago to get some headphones or something. And when I went in there, I was stunned to see that there's a huge surveillance section of home security stuff, cameras and motion detectors and lights and all sorts of shit. And I was like, this has become a way bigger industry than even it was during the height of what you're describing as stranger danger. In other words, that's what's so terrifying about your book, is that you've identified this weird kind of thing we think about as a nostalgic part of the 80s. Remember when we were all freaked out about kidnappers and every character on Different Strokes got kidnapped over the course of that show? Every show had or TV movie had a kidnapping plot. And even though that might have gone away as a huge cultural phenomenon, at the same time, the fear, the surveillance, the carceral part of it is all very much with us, and that part of it is really intense, because it means that we're still kind of basing our reality on this concept of the family that needs to be protected from the terror that's outside.
Yeah, and I think the fear might be, it's expressed in different ways now, but I think the fear is still there. And it is interesting that folks don't really kind of, I think, reckon with that, or they're unwilling to confront it. The idea that people, I think, acknowledge widely that, the 50s family or the 60s family is this very fucked up institution, even though some people kind of still lionize it, or, they want to replicate it in some form or fashion. And folks say the same thing about the 80s family, I think, to some extent, or even the 90s family. But it doesn't seem like they're interrogating the same ways in which kind of surveillance technology or kind of broader fears about the family today are very much the same thing. You saw this in spades after 9/11. The family home became this fortress again, or the fortress was fortified or refortified, right?
And the SUVs got very militaristic after 9/11, as I recall as well.
Oh, totally. Yeah, they all had the flag sticker on the back. I think it was in 11 that Elaine Tyler May wrote that piece, or it was her presidential address, I think, for the OAH, and it became the basis for her book Fortress America. But I think it really kind of laid out the paradoxes or contradictions within that. People increasingly move to gated communities. but they're increasingly likely to die in those communities because so ambulances can't get into these gated communities.
Oh my God, yeah.
There are these avenues that people believe are incredibly safe because they're so wide, right? So children can play, but that width allows people to think that they have more space than they actually do. So they end up hitting more children.
Jesus.
So it's this kind of it's this perfect encapsulation of kind of the paradoxes or just the nonsensical nature of the family itself. And I think in many ways that was true of the Cold War family too, right? There's this idea that the household is going to keep us safe. But
also it gives us meaning to imagine ourselves as like under attack. You know what I mean? I mean, there's this like really great, there's this really great moment in, I don't know, one of Michael Moore's movies. I don't remember. I haven't seen any of them in a long time, but there's one of them that I remember right after 9/11. It must have been Fahrenheit 9/11 or Bowling for Columbine or something, where it showed these people who were like in a very remote area. They were like in the middle of the country somewhere in Nebraska, like a pretty rural place, but they were fortifying their houses because they thought like Muslim terrorists were coming, and Michael Moore was, in his characteristic way, just kind of like goofing on them and just being like, look at these people. But to me, it kind of hits on something pretty profound, which is that, why is it that we have to imagine, like, it almost like it, you're not a family until you imagine that you're at war with like this enemy, whether it be the child molester coming for your kids or the Muslim terrorist or whoever it might be. I mean, like I said, I won't name them, but I have members of my family who are, gun owners and like that, they literally like basically sleep with a gun in their hand and they live in very safe places where crime never happens. And it's kind of like, it's such a misdirection. I wonder, and it's part of like, I think your book touches on it. I wonder if you could speak on it a little bit, which is that it really benefits, like, I don't know, power to be able to have a population that's imagining these threats, right? Like, it seems like a very, I don't know, it's like a consistent element of the American experience in some way. It does seem uniquely American in some way, like it's tied to like how armed we are and everything, but I thought that, I was so glad to see you make the Indian captivity narrative kind of connection, because it does seem like I'm not an American exceptionalist, but it does seem like a unique part of us. Like we really, really believe that we're under attack and we're going to have to violently defend our family at some moment.
Yeah, I think I don't know. This isn't a comparative study. And I wish it were in some ways. But it's not.
Yeah.
But I do think, and there are panics regarding child sexual abuse and kidnapping in the UK. It's pretty potent there. But I think, to your point, I mean, the scale of it is pretty unprecedented, or it's pretty American, or fundamentally American. There are these hallmarks of settler colonial societies, I think, that kind of that lead to those sorts of narratives. And this is a recurring feature in those societies, this kind of demonization or dehumanization, obviously, of the indigenous other, and this kind of assumption that they are particularly dangerous. But to your broader point, I mean, I think there is this. Nikhil Pal Singh talks a lot about the war and the fact that America, before it was even a nation, has been at war with any number of kinds of enemies, right? There are, according to him, there are the inner wars and there are the outer wars, right? You have this push, right, to the west, right, the conquest, quote unquote, of the wilderness and the so-called savage peoples, but also this war against black bodies, and of course that's a very fraught term, or within the academy it's kind of obnoxious, but I think it does kind of speak
it works
to something,
for me,
right?
though. You know what? There's a pushback against bodies and spaces. I've been noticing this. This is a small point, but I'm glad you brought it up, because I've seen that a lot. Like people making fun of this, and to me, it's a part of a larger reactionary thing against the humanities, that like this kind of language is easy to make fun of. But like, to me, like, bodies and spaces matter, man. And like, to me, like, that part of it, like when I'm reading about your narrative, that about stranger danger, it brings that up very powerfully to me, that like this touches on some like deep stuff to do with erotics and desire, and yeah, bodies as constructed as like almost, you know, subjects of empire and a hierarchy having to do with that. And yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the fear of your children being raped and murdered, what are you talking about but the protection and the sanctity of a certain type of body? And like that to me is important. So I'll defend the bodies and spaces discourse.
Me too, you know, and I think it can be abused and it can be exaggerated, and the same thing with spaces, right? But I think the point stands, right? I mean, and spaces, I think, is even is very useful as well. I mean, in spaces, I think, with respect to this book, is particularly potent because it does speak to the fact that certain spaces are understood to be dangerous.
Yep.
Certain spaces are understood to be safe.
Yep.
And there's a kind of twisted logic to a lot of that because maybe this venerated home is not all that safe after all. And maybe you don't have to mark certain spaces as dangerous, and that's not going to protect you, right? And mischaracterizing the threat is, it's dangerous in its own way. Right?
I love that, the home as a space, you know, where there's the book. I mean, I know people have written about that, but like even right now, like during the pandemic moment, there's I mean, I think it's like the government, like literal like government slogan, instead of like just say no, is safe at home, you know? And you're kind of like, safe at home. Wait a second. Like what you're saying and what you've identified is that, you know, a lot of these crimes that we're supposedly so concerned about actually emerge out of the home. And like that part of it, to say safe at home as like a constructed ideological space, home equals safe, is wrong. Like it's just wrong. Like this is
it
not,
is.
And so that part of it is really interesting because you're like, well, home is a safe space. And you're like, is it though? Because it's like, if you look at how people are hurt in our society, it's like one of the least safe spaces there is.
Totally. And to your point about guns, I mean, you're far more likely to shoot yourself or someone in your family than you are an intruder. But there is this sort of script or this sort of film that people play in their heads, you know, of invariably kind of a black or brown person breaking into their home and them shooting them, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of, and they fetishize that. And that is kind of, that's sort of the ultimate sort of, I don't know, that's this crowning achievement, right? In kind of the protection of the home. And of course it almost never happens. But yet it is kind of what people strive for, or they kind of crave it in some way.
Oh, totally. It's a fantasy.
It's totally sick, right?
Yes.
People have talked about this with respect to zombie films. You know, it becomes this sort of way to express a kind of racialized anxiety about, you know, the world run amok, and you have to protect yourself and your home or your family by shooting.
You know what? It taps on something. It taps into something that's like this fantasy.
Primal.
That's primal, and it says that, you know, it's a. I talked about this with Matt Christman on the show a long time ago, which is about the kind of like the violence. And the desire for violence. And if you're a person who's like thinks of yourself as kind of a liberal, or a person who doesn't do violence unless it's justified, you know, and that's why we talked about the Civil War being a place where a lot of like young men especially get into the Civil War early on, because it's a way where you can like imagine doing violence in a righteous way, you know. And like, so the family excuse is kind of an ultimate, it's always there as a justification. Like protecting your family will allow you to kind of justify unleashing the savage violence that lies within you, that really is ultimately like something you fantasize a lot more than you should, but is there as a kind of go-to constantly. And it seems like what you've identified with stranger danger is a phenomenon that, you know, evolves through time, but is one that's always there as this force of patriarchal violence. Yeah, one day I'm gonna have to unleash who I really am on these people, and that will protect my wife and my kids. And I definitely see that in the culture everywhere. I mean, isn't that like our movies like Taken and like shit like that? Like seem like they're entirely about like when a man is pushed to the edge, that's when he finds out who he really is, which is this like violent beast. It's such a big part of American culture. It's so gross.
Totally. And Taken is particularly gross because it traffics in all these Orientalist stereotypes. It's the brown man kind of whisking away the chaste white woman into sex trafficking. And so Liam Neeson has to go and kill all of them to avenge, she cannot be sullied, right? But yeah, it's just under the surface, if not kind of bubbling over almost always in American politics. I mean, you saw it with the Ahmaud Arbery shooting. I mean, that was very clearly kind of, these guys have to protect
totally
this neighborhood, right?
Yeah, that's great. That and Zimmerman, the Trayvon Martin case are both 100% like exactly what you're talking about. I mean, they are the stranger danger, right?
Yeah. Oh, and that connects to very clearly, I think, the sorts of surveillance technology that you were talking about, this sort of discourse of protecting the neighborhood. All that stuff is really, we just bought a house in November and we are on the Facebook group for the neighborhood.
Oh, Jesus.
And the stuff you see on there, it is just, it's a predominantly white neighborhood in a city with a sizable African-American population. And I'm totally shocked by everything that I see. There was a woman who was experiencing homelessness in somebody's backyard, and she called the police on her, and she posted about it. She's kind of proud of this. She's saying, "Oh yes, I need to protect my home or something." When this person it's broad daylight, she's probably just looking for a place to rest or something. Leave her alone. Or people saying,
no way. People are fucking psychotic about their homes. Person. Yeah,
they are. Yeah.
I wonder how much it will be. Part of our pandemic moment is more of that, because people are at home. They are like protecting their castles more than ever. It seems like something that your Facebook neighborhood watch group will be blowing up even more today.
Totally, yeah, and it's something I try to steer away from. In the most, for the most part, it's pretty tame and people are nice. But yes, there is, I think, this kind of anxiety that shapes a lot of their thinking on their home and their neighborhood and the sorts of imperatives that kind of drive them to post about, there was a suspicious guy kind of walking down the street. By what definition is he, suspicious? I think I know exactly what you're talking about, but there's a lot going on.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, it becomes a fantasy space where you can project all sorts of shit. And even reading through your book, I'm like, part of me is like, a lot of this shit just seemed like hysteria about gay men. Like that's what that's what's going on here, is that like gay men were all of a sudden a visible part of the culture in a way that they hadn't been before, coming out of the 70s, and now all of a sudden we're all hysterical about our sons being molested by strange men. It seems like there was a really powerful connection with that.
Yeah, it's the principal kind of motive that a lot of people argue is responsible for a lot of these cases, even though there's hardly any evidence ever to suggest that this is the case. But for a lot of these folks, it just has to be. That had to be the case.
Yeah,
they were looking for the smallest little shred of evidence to kind of substantiate those ideas. But I think it illuminates this broader kind of fantasy, or this broader sort of part of the American imagination, or this misunderstanding, right? That is kind of the essence of homosexuality, or at least that's how people.
It's like a weaponized misunderstanding, like like an intentional misunderstanding almost in some cases.
Yeah, and I think the same thing goes in many ways for the ways in which race kind of figures into a lot of cases in that moment as well.
Totally.
The Central Park Five, I think, is a pretty clear-cut example of that, and it's a very clear demonstration, I think, of a lot of the differential ways in which folks are conceiving of white childhood and black children, right? They are not children in the same way, or they're not vulnerable. They're actually criminal. They're actually these strangers that white children need to be protected from, right? And a lot of that rhetoric pervades the war on drugs as well. Matt Lasser's new book is very much kind of focused on that. The idea that, suburban white kids doing drugs are just sort of corrupted, and they are doing that because of drug pushers kind of invading the suburbs. And that's a trope that is present in the 50s and also the 70s and 80s and into the 90s and 2000s. And it's true. I mean, and I think that defines the opioid crisis as well, the way in which folks are conceiving of that, the way in which, white drug users are understood as different from, drug users of color or people who are dealing drugs, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we didn't talk about as much, but it's definitely in your book, and it made me think a lot, is like the DARE program when I was a kid, and like the connection between, because it seemed to me when I was a kid, it was all one danger in some way, that there were like and drugs were presented in a similar way. And if you remember especially the early like war on drugs, just say no ads, it was always this, it was very similar to the child molester. The figure of the drug dealer was this candy man, that's going to like open a van door and be like, hey kids, you want to try something? You want to get hot? And like, it was always, in other words, the drug hysteria and the stranger danger hysteria were combined, certainly in my mind, and it seems like it was the same in a lot of ways. The same carceral effort from the government were connected as well. In other words, like this was a massive expansion of the carceral system and law enforcement and surveillance, etc. And drugs, the fear of the drug dealer and fear of the child molester seem like they're the main engines of it in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and not to be overly simplistic, but it's I think everything can kind of be distilled down to there are, good people, good families, and they're racially coded in a certain way, right? And there are bad guys, and they need to be dealt with, right? First, you need to be kind of aware that this is the social problem, and then you have to kind of lock them up, right? You have to get tough. That's the only way to deal with this. And that those are the kind of I think interwoven logics of a lot of the ratcheting up of the carceral state in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and then of course so-called terrorists get kind of folded in, and other archetypes, these figures that, and to our point earlier about the welfare queen, I mean the social assistance provision of social assistance becomes entwined with the carceral state, and they share a lot of the same features. You're criminalizing poverty, you're criminalizing any attempt to get welfare or to get any sort of social assistance, and that relies on this kind of archetype of the welfare queen who's mooching off the system, who is a taker, right, in the formulation of
the Republicans
Paul Ryan, right?
Yeah, the Republicans are so fucking brilliant, man, because what they've done, and I know this is a simplistic narrative that I'm spinning here. I know that you can complicate this, but it seems like the Republicans create these monsters, and they're like, these monsters are the ones that are literally like raping your kids, murdering your family, they're taking everything from you. These, whoever it may be, they're in the city, they're black, they're gay. But they've actually like tied liberalism itself to it and be like, it's actually the liberals who are doing this. And like, if you're a liberal, you are enabling all these people. And like, it's actually liberals who let all these molesters out of jail. It's actually liberals who want, gay men to teach your kids. And it's actually liberals who want to enable the Muslims to come in through immigration. And it's actually the liberal. So in other words, the liberals end up being so defensive that like Bill, you have the rise of a Bill Clinton figure who's like, no, we're actually going to like take that narrative and turn it on its head and say we're actually more active on protecting your family from the child molesters and the Muslims and the blacks and the gays, etc. And it seems like by accepting those premises, we now have both parties that are engaging in this really, really ugly fucking discourse. And I think that there are so many elements to your book that I think are really great, but I think the main idea, and I wonder if you'd agree with it, that I was thinking the whole time I'm reading it is I'm like, wow, what a like act of misdirection, because what they're saying that this is what's fucking with your family. Like these are the things that are going to destroy your family are these imaginary monsters. When like what's really destroying your family is all the shit that we're doing. Like literally, what's really destroying the family is like alcoholism and poverty and all the things that come out of really ugly economic arrangements, unemployment and all those sorts of things. That's what's really gonna hurt your family. But instead, the families in America are all stuck thinking about this imaginary shit. In other words, it seems like it really, really benefits power to be able to kind of misdirect in terms of the threat. And it seems like your book does a really good job in describing a very specific moment in that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the misdirection, it does kind of rely on, it's not so much a misdirection as there's this idea that, there's the makers and then there are the takers. And yes, it's fine if you're a maker to get a lot of really generous kind of government subsidies or, support from the state. But if you're a taker, it's not. And so, the makers, to be very crude about it, will support any and all of these sorts of endeavors to basically fuck over those who are understood to be the takers.
Right.
So there's this notion, and I think people still kind of subscribe to this, even though I think it's been discredited, the idea that conservatism and the Republican Party over the last 40 or 50 years has been interested in cutting government. And that's just not really the case. I mean, they're not seeking to scale back the project of government. They're seeking to redirect it. Or, social policy is not, it's not retrenchment per se. It is moving things in different directions. It's the scaling up of the carceral state. It is, the scaling up of defense in many ways. And it's interesting that a lot of so-called makers or, and again, we're being overly simplistic here, but just for the sake of argument, they support that project. They don't care if more and more people are being locked up, if those people don't resemble them. And it's, if it's not hitting their communities, right?
Yeah.
So they're on board with that. They don't care if the carceral state is out of control. They don't care if they're bombing, countries that they've never heard of, as long as it's not really bothering them. But as soon as, and I think you see that in sharp relief now, the very idea that, okay, maybe we should stay home because there's a pandemic, that is understood by a lot of people as an infringement on their civil liberties. This is the biggest affront to civil rights, since Jim Crow.
Sure.
So yeah, I don't know if I'm really answering your question.
I see that discourse on my Facebook page for sure. Which is a really weird kind of paradox because like the home is where you're supposed to want to be, right? on some count, like that seems like the home is really what we've constituted as the most sacred space in American life. But on the other hand of it, like we said, like saying safe at home or saying everyone go home actually enforces a great bit of inequality at the same time. And that part of it is interesting. I wonder like, I really love historians like you that are talking about like childhood in the home, because and family, because I feel like it's such a kind of critical place. I mean, you talk about bodies and spaces, right? But it seems like a really important place to interrogate, because like, what is the home in American history, and and how is it racialized, and how is it genderized? And it seems like, when you think about the stranger danger hysteria, it's hitting on that stuff and showing how it's important from a million different angles. I mean, again, like I think your book is really tapping into something super important. I hope more historians will be working on these issues moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think childhood it's a very difficult type of history to do, the history of childhood and youth, because, children are this kind of minoritarian category or class of people, and they're not understood to be fully political subjects, right? They don't have the right to vote. They don't have kind of agency in a variety of ways. They are beholden to their elders, right? And yet, I hope, as my book demonstrates, I mean, a lot of our politics is premised on childhood and protecting the child, however that's constituted. Yes. And that can be a really dangerous sort of prospect. And yet it is one that is pervasive. It's universal. It's something that virtually nobody is kind of willing to interrogate or to challenge. Yeah.
Kids are useful politically, if that makes sense. And yet they don't have a lot of agency in that larger discourse either. It's such a rich field. And I want to mention your book again. It's called Stranger Danger: Family Values, Childhood, and the American Carceral State. Paul Renfro, thanks so much for joining us. I had a really good time talking with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. Okay, huge thank you to my guest, Paul Renfro. I had a really good time talking with him. Really intense stuff. But go check out his book, Stranger Danger, Family Values, Childhood, and the American Carceral State. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Thanks so much for supporting the show. If you want to get access to our bonus episodes and support us, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks as always. We'll talk to you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.